The God Delusion by Richard Dawkins, Chapter 6. Good morning. How are you doing today? Are you ready to dig into Chapter 6 of the God Delusion? Let's take a look at it. In this chapter, Richard Dawkins starts by talking about the various instances of moral rage that happens when Christians read atheistic literature. They get all upset and they spew venom at their perceived opponents. And, if somebody thinks that their faith is going to be pulled out from under them and they don't have a strong foundation, maybe they're a little insecure in their belief system or something, you're going to get some people that freak out, I guess. He calls it paroxysms of hatred. I don't know how to pronounce that word. And I confess I'm guilty of that too myself, but I'll talk about that a little bit later. Because I did say, when I started, I had some harsh words for Richard Dawkins. I said it was full of shit. And I already apologized, but I'll expand on that a little bit later. And so he gives examples. Now, the funny thing is that he doesn't give examples from his own correspondence. And he says that he's received tons and tons of correspondence. In fact, he puts a footnote. He says he's got so much correspondence that he can't reply to it all. And yet he doesn't use any examples from his own correspondence. Why is that? He's received tons of correspondence from Christians. I would expect that the vast majority of that correspondence is quite lucid and compromising and understanding and cooperative, right? Still trying to probably point him in the direction of the Christian faith, and of course of which he ignores. However, so he goes instead to somebody who produced a film, The God Who Wasn't There, Brian Fleming, who received a really nasty, horrible message based on his work that grieves my soul to read, knowing that somebody that shares my faith basically is coming out with such rage. But we don't know if that particular one individual was drunk at the time. Not that that's an excuse, but that does happen, and people lose control of their emotions. But he pulls that out as an example, and he had to go back to 2005 to find that particular correspondence. And then he goes another one from the editor of the magazine Free Thought Today, who received a letter and obviously forwarded it to Richard Dawkins for him to use. And again, he doesn't use any of his own correspondence. He finds something that somebody wrote to somebody else and says, look what this Christian did. These Christians, oh my goodness, you call this Christianity? They make this vitriolic, hatred, venom-filled comments. It's horrible. Those Christians are just, and he's got a point. That's why they're Christians in the first place. They have the capability of spewing venom. They recognize that, and so they go to God and say, God, can you help me out here? What am I supposed to do? Preacher tells them, follow Jesus. They say, okay, I'm going to follow Jesus. Then somebody comes along and says, oh, there's no Jesus, there's no God, it's just DNA. It's from the primordial soup. Meanwhile, this guy has been using this as a hope that he may have some kind of salvation, either in this life, the next, both, everything. And someone pulls that out from under him, and he gets all freaked out and goes back to his old ways again. You son of a bitch, you're telling me that I don't have anything to base my faith on? Of course the guy's going to freak out. And again, if drugs and alcohol is involved, you're going to have a whole gamut. I'm just very, very shocked and surprised that he hasn't used any of his own correspondence to give examples from. Secondly, I listened to a interesting recording. It wasn't a video, it was a recording of a interview that Norm Macdonald did. Yeah, the comedian Norm Macdonald, great guy, very funny guy. And he made an interesting point. He said, how come the atheist is always picking out the Christians of what's not true? He said, isn't it sort of an indication of that they kind of know that there's something to it, that they have to always gravitate towards that? But enough being said. I just find it strange that he has to go back to other people, friends of his, to get correspondence. And he says that this is because Dawkins says, well, it's because the Christians think that the teaching of atheism is nihilistic. Well, you know, I guess there could be all kinds of reasons for that. So let's go to my notes. What kind of notes did I take on this chapter? Did I take any notes? I hope I did. Here we go. Chapter 6. Yeah. Oh, okay. So I had given an example of the insult that I had made towards Richard Dawkins, and I was going to try and backpedal on it and use a academic reasoning as he does of why I did that, but I decided not to do that. It was supposed to be humorous. But he moves on and he talks about the selfish gene. But this moral outrage, of course I don't condone it in any way. It does grieve my soul. It makes me embarrassed to read those kind of statements. They're over the top. And so let me make clear that I wish all the best on Richard Dawkins and the other atheists that are out there. There's a growing number of them that are very, very popular people. They have a huge following. They're treated like gods amongst their followers, because when somebody follows an atheist like Richard Dawkins or Sam Harris or name any of the other ones, it lets them feel that they're part of that intellectual elite. It lets them feel they're part of that group which advertises itself, it makes no bones about it, that it's intellectually superior. It says, if you become an atheist, then you rise above, your consciousness becomes raised. This is what Dawkins repeats quite often in one of his chapters. He says, now your consciousness is raised and you're above theists. You're above people that believe in religion. I don't have a lot good to say about most religion either, because the term religion represents for me a lot of tradition, obedience, subservient, illogical based biases which are not the intent of the teachings of Christ. I follow the teachings of Christ. I follow the words of Christ. I try to follow the words of Christ. In my physical body, obviously, if I were to get drunk and sit down with Richard Dawkins, I'd probably call him a son of a bitch still, because I feel like the selfish gene could have been a reason of cause for a lot of damage that I would try and see if he would admit to. Now, it's interesting that in one of his footnotes, he says that Jeffrey Skilling, the CEO of Enron, his favorite book was The Selfish Gene, and that threw Richard Dawkins back on his heels. He said, there's somebody who explained why this might be the case. And kind of like, it's not my fault. He says he was mortified. He was mortified that this particular person, because the person was found to be corrupt. And this would be my tweaking. If he's tweaking the Christians, I mean, think about it. The chapter starts right off by stabbing at you Christians. You call yourself Christians, and all you do is spew venom at other people. And so I would probably want to do the same thing. Being the human that I am, I'd say, hey, Richard Dawkins, who has been motivated by your work? What are some examples of the things they've done and said? The people that have been inspired by your work. People that have been inspired by the Bible, you might as well say the whole population has been affected by the Bible, influenced by the Bible. You're going to have the outliers that have done horrible things, of course. It doesn't mean that they've clung to the teachings of Christ of love one another with all their heart. They've failed. They haven't fallen up to the standard. It would be the same for people that have read The Selfish Gene. Because some people are going to read it and say, what's the point? There's no use. There's no God, so I can do whatever I want. But we're not going to be able to see that. We're not going to be able to measure that. But it's interesting that he does mention that he's just as horrified when somebody uses his information for bad as when somebody reacts to it badly. Enough said. I'll move on. He talks a lot about the selfish gene in this particular chapter, which I've already addressed in a previous video, right? And so I'm not going to get into that. But then he goes in and he says, can a person be altruistic without a belief in God? He says there's 4 reasons why he says altruism can be based on adaptive evolution, Darwinian principles. He says there's four ways. The first one is kinship. So he says obviously from one generation to the next, a parent taking care of the kids taking care of their cousins, and the cousins taking care of the uncles, etc. It gives a greater chance that those genes will be propagated on into the future. And that's his whole premise, is that all that matters are the genes, right? Pardon me, the selfish genes as he calls them. And so that was the first one, kinship. The second one is this type of be nice strategy because you expect most other people to be nice, and a reciprocator. So it falls into the category of symbiosis. He doesn't like to use that word, but other people have. And so that's the second strategy, is that by helping others, they help you, it'll propagate, better chance of propagating the genes. The third one he called reputation. Now this one I think he misses the boat, because he's saying, oh, a fish sees is watching these other fish, and he's looking for a fish to clean his teeth. So he sees some fish do a good job, he sees some other fish do a poor job, so he picks the ones that do a good job to clean his teeth. He says that's reputation. It's just memory. It would fit into the same category as symbiotic relationship. So I think he misses the boat on number 3. There's no number 3. He calls it reputation. My guess is that he wanted to use that term to apply it to human behavior of current whatever. And the last one, conspicuous generosity. He bases this on the activities of specific islanders that do potlatch, and they try and outdo each other by being generous to the community. And this would be something that he says is evolved from Darwinian principles, because that helps that person propagate genes by, again, very weak category of a reason for altruism. Just we would use the term tradition. But anyway, enough. That's his theory, not mine. So he can make all the theories up he wants. He's done a good job of it so far. So he concludes on page 226. We do not need God in order to be good or evil. This is his conclusion on page 226. And the other one was an interesting question that was raised, that he said here. Let me see if I can find it. My notes all out of joint here. But yeah, there's a recently released recording of Norm Macdonald talking about his beliefs in God. Very worthwhile checking out. I'll mention that as a segue. Norm Macdonald, very funny guy. Well, I'm not going to find it. I'm just going to not worry about it. But the question was the 2 reasons why a person might not be moral, and it ends up in a dilemma. Well, that was people say we need religion when what they really mean is we need police. I thought that was an interesting thing, right? Richard Dawkins asked the question at the page on the top of page 228: do we really need policing, whether by God or by each other, in order to stop us from behaving in a selfish and criminal manner? I dearly want to believe that I don't need such surveillance, and nor do you, dear reader. On the other hand, he gives an example of when the police went on strike in Montreal in 1969, and by the end of the day, 6 banks had been robbed, 100 shops had been looted, 12 fires had been set, glass damage, millions of dollars of property damage. I'm not going to read it word for word. I'll just give the brief point of it. And then he quotes Sam Harris in his letter to a Christian nation, which is interesting. And that's interesting because today you see different stats bandied about the different states, whether they're Democrat states or Republican states, and they argue over which one is in a worse condition. In this example, at the bottom of page 229, he's saying that the Republican states are in worse shape than the Democrat states. So that you can, I'm sure you can get arguments on both sides of that from different people. Let's see what else we got here. So that's about it. People are not good, they only think they are good. My argument was that both the atheist and the Christian are both have a propensity towards evil. I don't think becoming a Christian automatically removes the propensity towards evil, and that's what a lot of people think. It gives them the chance to aspire to that state, and each person has a lot of work to do in perfecting themselves. The same thing an atheist would. When a person decides to become an atheist, all of a sudden they say, oh, now I'm in an elevated state. Now I am above the crowd, so I have to improve my behavior, maybe act more aloof, maybe act more calm and peaceful, and try and take on the demeanor of a Richard Dawkins, or especially a Sam Harris. The guy's like a stone, right? And so this would encourage them to improve their behavior. So whether they're adopting atheism or whether they're adopting a Christian worldview, their intention is to improve their behavior. And that would be something to think about, that there's room for both of these worldviews, as long as the end result, the proof in the pudding type of thing, is genuine and valuable. If something is genuine and valuable and encourages people towards more ethical and moral behavior, wouldn't that be a good thing? I think indeed it would be. However, if people adopt the values and world outlook of atheism, atheists, is that reflected in their behavior? Where are the letters from atheists, and what do those letters look like? Are they just as filled with venom, or even more so? Or the social behavior of atheists? Joseph Stalin, Jeffrey Skilling, the CEO of Enron, the people that only want to operate by survival of the fittest, no regard to empathy, no regard to loving your neighbor. Are there examples of atheists that are falling short of the moral standard that Richard Dawkins sets up in this chapter? And it's interesting that it comes back again to the Christian worldview as being the target. Now, he says earlier in the book that he says, well, I only use Christianity as an example because this is what I'm most familiar with. Fair enough. But it still remains to be seen that you're constantly referring back to Christian principles. It's the argument of Norm Macdonald. If you're constantly saying, well, that's got to be wrong, well, that's got to be wrong, that's got to be wrong. But usually there's something to that, whatever it is that you're so defensive about. And it is a form of defensiveness. Somebody doesn't go look around to find the most venomous letter that he can find to support his viewpoint. Why wouldn't he use his own personal experience and say, hey, you know what? I received a lot of letters from Christians, and a lot of them were saying that they're praying for me and that they're very kind letters. And maybe even some of them made me check my heart a little bit. And this is returning to my argument of the argument from personal internal experience, not from self-deception, not from damaged brain, like he says, oh, if someone has a visionary experience, it's probably a sign of prefrontal lobe epilepsy. One way to dismiss it. And or he just says it's, you know, they've been deceived because it's external events. They thought they saw a ghost, their eyes tricked them. He dismisses it outhand as being some external physical phenomenon that caused the person to be mistaken. No, I'm talking about the personal internal experience. I'm going to coin the phrase pie. That's what Richard Dawkins loves to do. He starts to coin phrases and name them after themselves. Again, he mentions Hamilton and also Trivers. You constantly go back to those guys. And so personal internal experience where you hear something, it could be a piece of scripture, the word of God, a letter from somebody, and it affects your heart and spirit and mind. It says, wow, this is something important. This is am I really responsible to God? And that's the question. People don't want to be responsible to God at any cost. They said, we don't want to have this man rule over us. This is the sentiment. And it's the man whose name starts with the letter J, and they don't want that name at all in their theology. And it comes through quite strongly. And so maybe there's something to that. Something to think about. So that's it for chapter 6. Again, as I mentioned, he did talk a lot about the selfish gene concepts. He brought that into that. And so if you want to see my views on the selfish gene, you can check my other videos on the selfish gene that I did. I already addressed that. And so I'm going to move on to chapter 7. But before I go, how am I doing for time? Oh, I've went on my time. I'm sorry. But I wanted to quickly say here, this is a condemnation to myself because I said that Richard Dawkins is full of shit. And I'm sorry, Richard, you're not full of shit. Okay? I was just kidding around. Come on. Let's be serious here. He says, why do you judge your brother? Why do you regard your brother with contempt? See what I did? I regarded Richard Dawkins with contempt, and I'm not supposed to do that. That's the rules, right? For we'll all stand before the judgment seat of God. We're all going to stand. So he's got to stand, I got to stand. So if I actually believe that, that's from Christian doctrine, obviously. He doesn't believe that. He says, oh, that's just, your stamp. He says, don't bother me with your stamp. Anytime, if somebody mentions anything religion or from the Bible, they say, oh, the Bible's not reliable. So they just throw it out offhand. You can't use scripture to talk to an atheist because they reject it outright. But it's words that were written by somebody. A human being had to write this down somewhere, and it's recorded, and it can be repeated. So I can still use the same argument, whatever the source is from. I could paraphrase it, and you wouldn't know where I'm getting it from. But I'm not going to try and be deceptive about it. I'm reading to you some scripture, right? So it says, therefore, don't judge anybody anymore, but determine this, not to put a stumbling block in a brother's way. So if Richard Dawkins is my brother, evolutionarily, I would say he's my cousin. If we watch the Scientific Atom by National Geographic, it tells us that we're all part of the same family tree, so I'd consider Richard Dawkins my cousin, and therefore, according to Darwinian principles, I would want to preserve him and look out for him and encourage him. But it also comes up here. Don't put a stumbling block in another brother's way. So if I become venomous in my speech and say, oh, that Richard Dawkins, that blankety blank, 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 and start talking like that, that's a stumbling block for the atheists. They look at that and say, look at that. You're full of venom. What good is your Christian belief if you're full of venom? And this is the point, of course, right? We return back to the words of Christ that say, love one another. Pray for your enemies. Love those that despise you and use you and despitefully use you and things like that. That's the principle that I want to follow and promote, even though I don't often act like it because I'm rough around the edges. But I can see the ideal, and I can see Jesus Christ in the distance and say, this is the truth. This is who I want to follow. This is who I could have hope in, that he might be able to transform me into a better version of myself, into a better person, into a better human being. This is my hope, right? He says, I know that and convinced that there's nothing unclean in itself, but to someone who thinks it's unclean, to him it's unclean. Did you hear that? That's actually a part of Christian doctrine. It says if somebody thinks something's unclean, see, because we talked earlier about the guilt that is usually often associated with religion. They say religion is just guilt mongering. That's it. It's just a guilt production factory. But this is talking about something different. This is talking about freedom. It says if you think something unclean, to you it's unclean. But he's convinced that in the Lord Jesus, there's nothing unclean in itself. Now, of course, it's talking about food, right? But it can be extrapolated into other things. It says, don't destroy with your views, with your ideas, with your words, with your food. Don't destroy with what is important to you, him for whom Christ died. Don't do that. And that message can be given both to the Christian, to the atheist, to the Muslim, to the Jew, right? It can be given to the Democrat, it can be given to the Republican, it can be given to the left, the right, the liberal, and the conservative. You have a valuable view in your mind, and to you it's good. Then don't use that valuable view and good to destroy somebody else. This is the message of the gospel. It's a message of peace. And there are many messages like that that have been given by Christ. And that's not even a quote from Christ. It's a quote from one of his followers who spent time with Christ. The book of James is an interesting book because I believe, that's not from James, by the way, but I believe that's a transcription of the words of Christ. But I'm going to segue and I'll run out of time, so I'm already over time. But interesting stuff. I'm moving on to chapter 7, which is called The Good Book and the Changing Moral Zeitgeist. I have a feeling it's going to be talking about the veracity of the Bible or scriptures, and it's going to start trying to attack the first section, the Old Testament, right? That's the title of the next thing, and he's going to pull out all the horrific stories, I'm guessing, so I got to go through that. Is the New Testament any better? Yeah, I'm going to have fun with that. So, I love thy neighbor, etc., etc. So he's going to start attacking the scriptures, which is an easy target because you can cherry pick and you can cause a lot of holes to be created by whatever he's going to do. So chapter 7, I got about how many pages? About another 40 pages. These are long chapters. There's only 10 chapters, so I got 3 more to go. I've finished 60%. 30. Wait a minute. I did 6 chapters. 7, 8, 9, 10. I got 4 chapters left. I'm not very good at math, am I? Thank you so much for watching. God bless you. I wish I could do a live stream, but I need 1,000 subscribers to do that, and that's a long ways away. But if you want to subscribe, go ahead. If you're studying Richard Dawkins or atheism, or if you're considering atheism or Christianity, it doesn't matter what you consider. I think the important thing is to consider that the words of Christ. How many people are familiar with them? Not many. They'll pick all the other words, the Old Testament and the words of New Testament, which is from a lot of different writers and a lot of different humans that are fallible and can make mistakes and make a lot of, convoluted arguments and reasoning. But I have a feeling that for the rest of the book I'm going to be focusing a little more on the words of Christ. So we'll see if that helps me navigate through. Sorry, Richard, I did call you a piece of excrement when I first started doing these videos, especially when I did the selfish gene, because I didn't like the selfish gene. I don't think it was based on anything. But now that I'm going through this book, I'm starting to get a better understanding of where you're coming from, and I can start to see the reasoning behind the efforts. And the reasonings are wanting to solidify a position to be able to point and say, that can't be true because that person is not perfect. That can't be true. And so imagine the burden of these atheists walking around having to keep themselves pious and holy, because now the shoe's on the other foot. And they're like, we're intellectually superior, and I simply believe in one less God than you do. Well, I simply believe in one level of technology higher than you do. How about that? Think about that. Think about what's happening in our world and how technology is becoming a archetype for God, right? Something to think about. So I went longer. I was going to go 20 minutes. I ended up going 30, but I'll wrap it up at 30. Thank you so much for watching. I hope it is a blessing to you, whoever you are, whatever your belief and whatever your political stripe. I pray that God blesses you, and guides you, and leads us all forward in an atmosphere of love and cooperation. Take care. Bye-bye.